talked about next webcast would be about enhancing or understanding or unleashing those positive relationships. But you've got to have a set of, well, we've talked about a set of beliefs that can help structure and frame that. What are the behaviours? We've gone through the habits. What are the behaviours that can actually make it happen? So in this webcast, we're really talking about those behaviours. They're probably ones you've never heard of before. What sort of behaviours are we talking about?
Well, in this slide, Adriel, we're going to talk about total behaviour. So what Dr. Glasser has said is there are 4 components to total behaviour. So we will have thinking, acting, feeling and physiology. All of those behaviours are happening together. It's just...
Do we mean just physical by physiology? Is there more to it than that?
With the feeling is our emotional state, our psychological state. The physiology is what we experience in our body. Most people are not conscious, and I must say it took me a while to get onto this, are not conscious of really being insightful about where are my muscles tensed, you know, is my gut churning, have I got tension across the shoulders, do I feel my scalp tighten up? A lot of people aren't conscious of that because they're signs.
It's interesting, you would have seen in the last webcast, we talked about that gut instinct and the physical feeling of it. And if it's in an unhelpful context, it's a fear-based thing. It feels like those butterflies. But in the case of doing a great speech, you need the sense of butterflies and that emotion, that sensation, to actually nail it.
Oh, absolutely. I mean,
it's
not
the
all,
same physical feeling though.
Yeah, and not all stress is bad. If we didn't have any stress at all, we probably wouldn't get up in the morning.
Why bother?
Yeah, exactly, because it'll just be, well, we'll just plateau out here. But some level of stress is helpful. It's when it tips, that's when we're in big trouble.
So these behaviours, the new ones you're introducing today in components, can unlock that?
Yeah, it can help us understand.
Yeah.
So if we say all behaviour is total, so those 4 components are working together, the behaviour, what we're doing, the thinking, the feeling and the physiology. The other thing we say is our behaviour is generally learnt. It'll be learnt by trial and error, it could be learnt by mirroring, we watch others, how we grew up, we watch what people did, how they reacted in different circumstances. Behaviours are chosen. We choose our behaviours. So very often we're not conscious of the fact that we're choosing them. So we choose our behaviours to get what we want. That's what we do. Except there is an exception here in the times of shock. So for example, if you're just driving along the street, you stop, you're at a red light, you stop, and someone hits the back of you, the behaviour you might exhibit when you get out of the car may be as a result of absolute shock.
Okay.
Until you've had time to process. I'm okay, what's happened, speak to the other person.
It's okay to acknowledge in the world we're living in, particularly economic times, there's been a few shocks, and that's okay, but it's important we move on with some new behaviours.
Yes, and the other thing we need to tell ourselves, it's really, really important that our behaviour at the time is the best that we can do under the circumstances and with the information that we have. Otherwise, we'll spend our life beating ourselves up that we're not doing this well enough or we're not doing that well enough. It's pointless. The interesting thing about when we go to change our behaviours, though, is that it may feel really difficult and uncomfortable, purely because we have practiced these behaviours for such a long time. And it's hard to stop and reform a new behaviour habit. It's really difficult to do. So
it's about persisting there.
Yes.
If you know the end game.
Yeah. One of the things I was told about exercise, for example, was that it takes 3 weeks for the brain receptors to form a new habit of exercise. So you've got to really encourage yourself, support yourself to get out there, walk every day in my circumstance, and then after 3 weeks that's set and your body will choose to do that. And if you don't do it, there will be this niggling, or maybe I could go out and have a walk, I need to be out in the sunshine. And I thought, oh yeah, we'll see. Well, it's actually true. I actually did that, and then after the 3 weeks, when I might go, oh, I don't think I'll go for a walk today, I just felt, no, I need to go. You know, the impetus was there because I'd changed the behaviour.
And then it became instinctive.
Yes, and it was really positive. I was really surprised. And that's a simple example. But, for those who may be doing no exercise at all, maybe not a simple example. But the main thing about our behaviour that we need to understand is it's total. The 4 components work together all of the time, whether we're aware of it or not. Being aware of it is much more helpful. And we are doing the best we can with the information we have in the circumstances where we find ourselves.
So sometimes we can be confused by that initial pain of change enough to sort of put it on the back burner, or always put it on the back burner.
And that's often, if you want to change, if you want to move away from a negative disconnecting habit, say of blaming, to one of accepting, that's a very different choice of behaviour. And, it's challenging. So you do have to keep practicing, but not beating yourself up if you don't get it right. Life is experience. The thing that's really important is the intent is there to say, I need to change that behaviour. I need to move away from blaming and move myself to more accepting behaviour, because it is healthy for me. It will build a positive relationship with the people I want to build positive relationships with. And in the workplace, it certainly is conducive to a very probably happy, enthusiastic and productive workplace.
We're sort of talking about change management without the potholes in some ways. I would say, I was thinking about this the other night, sort of doing a roast dinner and then washing up the pan. You need the hot water, you need the soap. You are going to get it clean, but sometimes as you're scraping it and scrubbing it, it actually gets dirtier before you can get it cleaner.
That's right.
It gets dirtier and more painful before it gets better.
It's exactly right. And I think that's how life is, and that's how change, if you've done a particular thing all of your life, depending on your age, it's really difficult to change.
And you can see the tension people have when they're doing this based on generational sets of ways of doing it, whether in a family or in a business culture. It's enormously difficult, and that's why it's good to have support as you're doing it, but also acknowledge yourself with the more small successes that you've done. And
be kind to yourself while you're doing it.
Cathy, you're going to introduce us to an analogy about a car. What's that about?
Well, in the total behaviour, one of the best ways, and the analogy is a car, and it's a really interesting concept, because if we look at the car suggests we're going somewhere, so it's moving along in direction. So we will say the front wheels are what we're doing, our acting and our thinking. These are the wheels we have most control of. The feeling and the physiology refer to the back wheels. They come along with the movement. So if you are feeling sad, for example, and I come to you and say, I want you to feel happy now, Adriel, that's really challenging.
Jarring.
It is, and challenging to do. But if you think about an instance where you may have been at home, you may have been having a little argument at home with your kids or your spouse or whatever, there's a knock at the door, you go and answer the door, and you've got some friends there who've come for a visit. You don't bring them in and continue on with the argument. You generally stop the argument dead. So immediately you're on the front wheels of the car, you've changed what you're doing and you've changed what you're thinking. So you've put that aside and you've come in, and if you had angry feelings and your physiology was tight, because you're now welcoming someone in, you're making a cup of tea or coffee, you're going to sit down and have a chat, the tension in your body will be releasing, and your feelings of frustration and possibly anger will dissipate because you've changed what you're doing and thinking.
I think of the term cooler heads will prevail. I've often said to someone, you can see some visitors at the door, just rush over and put some cold water on your face. It's not because they've got anything on their face, it's to lower the temperature, literally.
Yeah. And when you think about it in the context of behaviour, you can, if you're asking yourself, as the question I raised before, if I say or do this, will it bring me closer to what I want or take me further away? Then that question immediately says to me, should I change what I'm doing? And should I change what I'm thinking? So instead of thinking about how mean I could be or revengeful, and instead of carrying out an action that would demonstrate that, then I can go, stop, let's do something else. Let's do something more positive and move to an accepting behaviour, or maybe a negotiating of differences behaviour, respect, support, whatever.
It's really a fundamental issue with that. I mean, we're talking about language and that in the last parts of the webcast. For Australians and Australian culture, we don't intrinsically think that way, do we? As culturally as Australians.
I don't think most people do, because I think, and only think about the news, just for example. And if you turn your TV on now, the news that you will get is nothing. There's nothing enlightening or happy or, you know, a good sense of feeling about it. It's all about fear.
Yes.
We're having so much fear promoted. So people are sitting in this space, and if you look at that total behaviour, people will be thinking negative thoughts. They will probably be inactive and frozen because they're frustrated or don't know what to do. Their body will be tense, so that's their physiology, and their feelings emotionally are probably fearful. And so how do you stay well, and how do you look after your mental well-being if you're in that state? So if you think about behaviour as being total, front wheels, what you do, what you think, the back wheels, what you're feeling and what your physiology is, it's a really good analogy. And I have a car sitting on my desk in my office all the time, so I'm checking in because it's a visual. It's a good analogy for me to think about. And just on that as a tip, and I won't go into it in detail, but on the car also, we've got rear vision mirrors and we have a windscreen. So I often challenge myself over time, how much time am I spending looking through the rear vision mirror instead of the windscreen? So if there's something positive to be learnt about my behaviour in the past, it's worth reflecting. If there isn't, and it's just going to be more soul destroying, then maybe I need to spend more time looking through the windscreen. Where I'm going, where are the opportunities?
A lot of people that engage with me, and I wouldn't say people who've been in a very distressed lived experience point of view, because they've, however traumatic the situation, they've spent a lot of time looking in the mirror and looking in that rear view mirror in particular for lots of reasons out of their control, and that's okay. But what they've done is they have sat in that space for so long, how do we do the next thing?
That's exactly
So
right.
when we're saying doing the next thing, I'm not telling you to move on or harden up or get over it. I'm just saying, how do we move on to the next thing along the way? And part of that, just like having your L plates on in that car, how are you coaching yourself for success? And that's where it comes back to what's on this modelling. It's not just about your team and your workplace, because you could be the sole trade and there's no one else to talk to but you. That's it.
And that's where I found having the car analogy was really, really helpful, because one of the things we can do is convince ourselves that it's impossible to change, convince ourselves that there are many excuses, which isn't really that helpful. What we need to be possibly thinking about is, yes, this is going to be a challenge. How am I going to go about it? Be kind to yourself. I can't say that enough. And think about total behaviour. So it took me a while to actually be able to have the insight to look at what my physiology was happening in my body. What was happening? You know, where were the tense spaces? How could I relate to those that tension dispersing when I changed the things I had the most control over, which was my thinking and my doing, and then how that impacted on my emotional state. It's really, really important, and I think that's another key learning that people, if you can understand what happens with total behaviour. And I think that's one of the key things when Dr. Glasser was developing the choice theory model, was about where are the tools we could give people to make those changes in their lives if they so choose.
If you think of we're creating something new, it's not just talking about the tools to keep it going and running smoothly. We're also talking about the ingredients to make it in the first place. I mean, one of the messages that you see in one of your slides is from Roosevelt about those ingredients related to yourself. We're talking about those ingredients. Cathy, we're talking about some tips that people could have in their head, memorised.
Yes, absolutely.
They don't have to be complex.
No,
But
very simple.
You were saying about it being something you can check in on yourself about.
Absolutely.
So what are those tips? And you'll see them on the screen. What are those tips that might, and you might add some for yourself, make it personal.
So
those tips?
if we can accept and celebrate difference, and we've talked a bit about that, that's a wonderful thing. If we can listen effectively, be in the presence of the other, and by that I mean you're not clouding your mind with what I'm going to do next, what answer I'm going to give. I'm genuinely listening to the person. Give people your time, and we talked about that in Enhancing Connection, that you spend some time with people in the workplace, spend some time with family, particularly young kids and teenagers. Put the technology away, and we'll come to that.
Can I just say with that, I looked on here, it is in like a practical thing to encourage brain health. Number 5. We're not talking about, neurobiology or something. We're talking about things that affect your brain, and that might be the light coming off a mobile phone.
Exactly, could well be, and that sense of I need immediate response all of the time,
I see what you
and I
mean.
can't put it down. I've got to answer it. It rings. This is a really good one about behaviour. Do you answer the phone because it rings, and can you let it ring? A lot of people cannot let their phone ring. They must answer it. So the phone is driving their life. For people to be thinking differently about it, I will choose whether I answer the phone or I don't. I'm not saying you don't answer the phone, but be conscious. Is the phone driving me, or am I driving what's happening?
It's funny you mention that, because I was watching a TED talk about this, and it discussed, Disney Studios, they, in their theme parks, wanted what could be projects for young children to do as activities on their sites. And their research came up with one fascinating thing, that the young children, the toddlers and others, really love mobile phones. Even to the point of babies chewing on mobile phones. And with the idea thought was that they were actually chewing it because they were teething. They were chewing it, what they found in their research, commercial research, not mental health well-being, that it was the affection that machine or that product or the drive it rings so mum and dad jump at it, that it got, and that's why the bub wanted to have an attachment with it. How sad is that?
Oh, that is really
It's
sad.
devastating.
Actually, there's a young girl, she was 7 when she made the podcast. She's 8 now, and she has been, her video was, I think it's 5 tips before 5. And
5 p.m. or 5 in
year 5, yeah. So for parents to do with
I
kids.
see what you mean.
And the key thing she talked about was saying to parents, put your device down. I want your contact. I want the physical contact. Her webinar or podcast was the most viewed last year or this year.
One other thing I'm interpreting this, and we're based into the ways of wellbeing for small business, even in Townsville, is that we're not just talking about little toddlers, startup companies, sole traders, and those that are finding their way in business, particularly when it's attached to their purpose, like I mentioned with veterans and others, people from the culturally and linguistically diverse community who are trying to find confidence in business in a new country. They are taking baby steps, and they need that confidence and attention being given that doesn't need a distraction.
That's right. And if we go back and think about the tips, and we talk about develop your communication skills, well, we've spent quite a bit of time through the podcast talking about that, how we might do that. The key, again, is manage mobile technologies. How do we do that? How is it effective for me to use that? How is it destructive? Think about those things. Very sad if we have babies thinking that that's a thing I've got to connect to.
Well, we're not talking about something that's particularly persecution of mobile phones.
No.
I mean, if it was 400 years ago, it would probably be the paintbrush for Vincent van Gogh. But if that's the case, what is it? Acknowledge it and manage it.
Absolutely. The other key tip is learn to give and take feedback. One thing I'll say here, personally, I don't believe there is any such thing as what we call, criticism? Useful criticism. Constructive criticism. Whatever it's, criticism is criticism. That's it for me. There are other ways.
Starts with that word.
That's
here
right.
We go.
Yeah.
Here we go.
No such thing as constructive criticism. So, but we can learn to give and take feedback in a positive way that will build relationship. We also talk about learning to trust more, trust yourself more, and trust those people around you more. The world that we live in now, is breeding an enormous sense of distrust, which is probably very sad. And the last one, which I think was very interesting, is develop empathy. So what is it like, before you make any comments about anybody, what is it like to stand in their shoes? You probably can only get a sense of that. We don't know because they're not my shoes, but you can get a sense of that. And I think that is a really excellent way to think about being more accepting of difference, being more supportive of people.
Can I just ask you, what's the difference between sympathy and empathy?
I think sympathy, to me, is about a feeling of sorrow, sadness, you poor thing sometimes, whereas empathy is I stand in your shoes and I get a really different point of view and I get some understanding of what your journey may be like.
I don't need to save you.
Oh, no.
But I've stood in your shoes.
And I can understand. Like, I can't understand what it is to be a refugee living in Townsville, which is a settlement city.
Yeah.
But I can stand in your shoes and get some insight by listening to your story, listening to what you're telling me, listening to what's happening. And I can get a sense of, oh, okay, that's how it is. Then from that, I can come up with how can I work with you.
Okay.
Not do to you.
It's the building blocks.
I think so, but it's
Because
the understanding.
People can have a good heart about something or want to do some great business venture that, yes, it's going to create jobs, but it's doing something to someone.
Yes, not helpful.
You know, you see that in a suburb that, you know, we're going to make this big thing, and you're like, well, you're doing it to us. Work with us.
Yeah, and it's about, like, if I've got a great idea and I take it out there and I put it out there and I take it to the people and say, you've got to do this because it's really good for you, that's just doing to or for. For people to do something, they need to own it.
So if we're talking about owning it and ownership being something that's valued by all and sundry, we're really talking about number 4 on this wheel of continual improvement. And that is about an approach. It's not just land there. And that's what we'll be discussing as we talk about lead management in our next webcast, our final webcast of this series. But there's more to come, and it will evolve as we talk about it more. Make sure you own this webcast and this training and see what it applies to your well-being and where you live and where you work. Thank you.
Thank you, Adriel.